Hello, my fan friends, and today we're going to be talking about the Casablanca Fan Company and what actually went wrong. Because somewhere along the way, they also lost the way. So, let's hop right on into this, shall we? Casablanca was founded in 1974 by Burton A. Burton out of Pasadena, California. Now, back in these days, he only had a few employees, and they made just some really solid, really well-built fans, and in some ways they were slightly chintzier than what they would later become, because the company was just starting out, and in the 70s a lot of fans were a little more chintzy than what we saw in the 80s. Lots of them had good quality, however still there was just a lot of execution things that weren't very good, and even with Casablanca this was the case. They continued to produce their fans throughout the late 70s, and then in the early 80s, they introduced a few different things. But first, towards the end of the late 70s, they had a few different models, like the Broadway, the Columbia, the 20th Century, the Victorian, the Four Seasons, and the Zephyr. And I don't know if I mentioned the New Orleans Centennial, but that one as well. Of course, back then I think it was just called the New Orleans. But anyways, that was like the main line of fans back in the day. And they were all essentially replicas of antiques. The only thing that wasn't really was the little Four Seasons, even though it was definitely very similar to some other antiques. So overall, basically everything was an antique replica. And of course, Burton started this company because he was inspired by seeing some old fans and thought, I can sell these. And well, he did. And throughout the 70s, they used the bell canopy mount. They did not use hang trues back then, which is something I'm sure a lot of people know Casablanca for. And they used cardboard box variable speeds and Emerson K63 motors. But then in the early 80s, they began to introduce things like the hang true canopy, which was designed to be basically an easier mounting system, just a more well-balanced and easy, just basically it was designed to be the ultimate ceiling fan mounting system, and of course we will see later on why that wasn't the case, and regardless of the fact that we will talk about later, in my opinion, it's still absolute garbage and I hate it. They also went from the K63 motor to the K55 motor. The older K63 motors weren't as efficient, and then they also generated a lot of heat, and the bearings tend to cook themselves rather easily. So in a way it was kind of an upgrade, but also in a way it was a downgrade. It all depends on how you look at it. They also slightly altered the appearance of some of their fans, and then they also introduced the slumber quiet system. Now, even when Casablanca, was at its best, they still had lots of flaws, and slumber quiet was one of them, and basically anything else slumber except for slumber 3, so in other words slumber 5 as well. Both Slumber Quiet and Slumber 5 were either variable speed, which was Slumber Quiet, and Slumber 5 was 5-speed. And both of these control systems used essentially what I believe was like a potentiometer, and then they also used a heat sink. Now, these were extremely unreliable, and if you find one that works these days, you're honestly pretty lucky. I feel like they get harder and harder to find as time goes on. I've got like 3 or 4 slumber fans, not a single one works, and one of them was converted before I even bought the dang thing. So yeah, that should basically tell you all you need to know about that. And it was very quickly replaced with the, I guess you could say it was quickly replaced, kinda not, depends on how you want to look at it. But then they introduced the IntelliTouch control system in around 83. This was their main computerized control, and this was one of their biggest, claims to fame. They had so many different prototypes, and they spent millions on it. They even did a satellite broadcast back in the day to just get the word out and just to be eccentric, to be cool. And that was part of what made Casablanca so awesome around this time period, was not only were the fans, good besides the control problems, but if you took those out of the equation, or some of them would last long enough to be reasonably reliable, you had a really, really good fan. But besides that, we had the fact that Burton was just such an eccentric. He was just such a unique and amazing and just funny and interesting, just all the things, all the good things. He was that kind of individual. And a couple examples that I can remember from Dan's workbench video that he did on Casablanca is that one day they were talking about there being a lack of trees in the parking lot. By the end of the day, there were trees. One time he stopped a big meeting to show everybody a snake that got in his car. And I think at some point there was an elephant that got involved in one of the meetings, I think. So yeah, he was a very eccentric and very interesting individual. And that, in my opinion, is also just what made Casablanca so amazing. They were, it was out there. And I felt like that really brought in a lot of clients as well. There were just so many amazing things that they did back in those days that just really marketed this brand as the best ceiling fan out there. And then in around 1985, they introduced that Slumber 5 system, which was probably the worst control system they ever had. It was nicknamed the Boomerang because within like 6 months, they had tons of people calling saying, hey, yeah, my fan quit working. So then they discontinued that a year after and moved to Slumber 3, which is the only control system from Casablanca, I should say non-computerized control system. Actually, I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. I don't know. I'm blanking, but basically, Slumber 3 fans are like the only Casablancas I would ever leave installed long term. Slumber Quiet, IntelliTouch, any of that I would not do. It would have to be like an accessory control system, or the Slumber 3, or the built-in solid state cardboard box. Those would be the only ones I'd install. Or if the Slumber Quiet's already broken or an IntelliTouch fan has been converted, then I would also do those. But as long as the original electronics are in place, I tend not to run them very often just because, they're not too reliable. But anyways, then throughout the 80s, they continued to add more designs. Eventually, they added a lot more 5-blade fans into the mix. And they just continued to expand. And in 1991, they introduced the Comfort Touch control, which was even bigger and crazier than the IntelliTouch. This was a handheld remote with a thermostat built into it. It had tons of smart features like the IntelliTouch. However, they were easier to use, plus there was even more available to you. And not to mention, it had an LCD screen on it, which was pretty darn cool. So overall, they were just continuing to upgrade, and they were getting more ambitious and more creative with their designs. And then 1993, there was a little bit of a problem. They had to recall the hang true, and this was bad. Basically, every single hang true made from the start of its production in around 1980, 1981 to September of 93 were recalled due to the castings being weak and fans being able to fall through. Cole over at Vintage Fans and More did a video where he was showing how a gradual wobble can send the fan right through to the floor, and yeah, it's not good. And that is why they had to issue recall clips to put in the hang true. And actually, I have one of those over here. I actually have 2 of them. So they had to introduce these bad boys to make the fans safe again. And luckily they worked. I've had many fans installed with a recall clip and they haven't fallen. Same goes for many other collectors out there. So, oh, and also non-collectors as well, because they did send those out from the factory. I have a 1993 Delta 2 that was made just before the recall, or maybe it was made, part of it was made after and the hang true was made before. Either way, it had a recall clip right in the box with a little notice in it saying, hello, due to a safety recall, a voluntary safety recall, we had to include this. Please use it in your fan to protect yourself or something like that. But anyways, that definitely was not good. And also around 1993, they replaced the original IntelliTouch with the new IntelliTouch 2. And it was also around 1992-93 that I noticed a bit of a shift in Casablanca. Everything before that I absolutely loved, and I love everything after 2. Except, I can't describe it. There was just a little bit of a shift. They altered some of the light kits a little bit, and they also slightly altered some of the fans. And then the IntelliTouch was redone. And by this point, though, they still made great quality fans that you could absolutely rely on. But then what really did the company in, and why I even have to make this video, happened in 1996 when Hunter Fan Company bought Casablanca. Now, before this, Burton was there most of the time. There was a little bit of time that he took off from the company and then returned. At one point, they asked him back, I believe, because the company was not doing so good. They filed for bankruptcy like 3 or 4 times throughout their existence before Hunter. So, there are already some signs, that they're getting a little too big for their britches. It's just not always you know, they're not always paying the best attention to money. You know, they're always just trying to develop all these products and do all this instead of focusing on, you know, making sure that they can stay afloat. Fortunately, they did. And then when Hunter bought them out, then we noticed a bit of a shift. They introduced their own specific motor. Now, this could have already been in the Casablanca plans before Hunter bought them. I'm not 100% sure really, but they introduced the XLP motor. And this, instead of using, you know, the Emerson K55 or any of those other outsourced motors, this was their own motor designed specifically for the Casablanca fans. They used that instead. And then throughout, you know, the late 90s, I noticed a real shift in the designs. A lot of the earlier Casablanca stuff, it all followed a very similar format and construction. But then around the mid to late 90s, I noticed there were a lot more departures from that classic style. For example, you know, most Casablancas that I can think of from the 80s used a very similar format to the Zephyr here. You know, they had the same switch housing, you know, the same sandwiched together face plates and sideband. Only difference is there would have just been a different design on it. Then they all used the same down rod here or a similar one, and then they all used the hang tree. You know, basically every fan was like this. There wasn't much alteration to it. It was basically always this. However, then I noticed that things eventually did begin to change. They got a little more ambitious, and this definitely was not a bad thing. This was great. We were seeing tons of new designs and tons of other very, very interesting things that just overall expanded the brand and once again brought the luxury back into Casablanca. Because I feel like throughout the early mid 90s, Casablanca lost a little bit of its edge. Like, it was still a great manufacturer. However, everything was just so, it had been done for ages now that there just wasn't too much new and exciting stuff. And I actually did notice that when Hunter bought them out throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, they really got a little more adventurous with the designs, and they were very interesting, and they produced honestly, some of my favorite designs of all time. So overall, at first, it definitely was not a bad thing. Not to mention that in the early 90s, Casablanca did also buy out Homestead, so they had a few of their designs lying around, a couple of which would make returning appearances throughout Casablanca's timeline after the fact. So yeah, overall, at this point, Casablanca was still very good, and I would consider them to be very good all the way up to about 2012. But of course, let's go through the early 2000s for a little bit here. In 2000, Casablanca took many of the models like the Delta, the Panama, the Ventura, the Victorian, the New Orleans. Basically, a lot of the classic fans, a lot of the mainstay fans, they redesigned them, they increased the blade pitch, they slightly altered the designs of them. And at this point, they also added a 2 at the end of the name, so instead of Panama 5 or Panama, it'd be Panama 2. And the Delta technically became the Delta 3, since there was already a Delta before that, or a Delta 2 before that, sorry. And then they also added concealed hardware to the blade arms. They basically just made some slight alterations to a lot of the designs. Once again, this is nothing bad. They're just bringing the products up to date. And then right around 2001 is what I consider to be the end of a lot of the really, really classic products, because by this point, fans like the Lady Delta and the classic Victorian and New Orleans designs and some of those things were on their way out. And then after 2001, the Delta was discontinued, and that basically just left us with the Panama and the Ventura, and then the Victorian was still around, and so was the New Orleans and some of those other classic designs. They were just, you know, altered. So by this point, you know, anything original had been basically redone and phased out. You know, nothing was really like it was before. Of course, a lot would argue, and I would agree with the fact that that was like that for a little while before that even. And then around 2002, they started introducing more designs. And then around 2004, 5, and 6, these years were all really big. They added tons of new designs, and they were getting more ambitious. 2006 had like the biggest intro ever. There were like almost 20 new products. And then we also saw a similar intro around 2009, where there was also just an absolutely insane amount of products. So throughout the 2000s, they just continued to expand. And another thing that they also did was, instead of just marketing, you know, their high quality XLP motor, they started offering a lot more direct drive fans. Of course, this started happening more in the late 90s. However, they became way more apparent down the line as they went. And they even tried to pull a once over on a lot of the the showrooms, and I'll show you here. This here is a early 2000s Concentra fan that uses a spinner motor, but you'll see that they tried to mimic the flywheel design on the spinner motor itself to basically try and just give the impression that, oh yeah, it's still a stack motor, it's still really good. Arguably, it's still a really good fan. However, in some ways, the performance of the redesigned models were actually better, I am ashamed to say. But anyways, you know, in some ways they kind of cheapened, in other ways they didn't. One thing with a lot of these direct drive Casablanca fans was that they had a little bit of a hum to them. Basically, anything that was non-XLP, you would notice a little bit of a hum with. It was rather hit and miss whether you'd get the hum or whether you wouldn't. And then they also introduced the XTR motor, which was kind of like a sort of skeletal type motor, and they introduced it on fans like, I believe, the Panama and maybe a couple others. This thing was ungodly loud, and there honestly wasn't that much point of it. And I kind of feel like the reason why they introduced the XTR motor to the Panama series was they were trying to sort of reinvent the wheel, you know, sort of revive something that was kind of dying. However, it didn't really work. There was no point of getting the XTR over the XLP unless you wanted the uplight that the Halo model added. So there wasn't really all that much of a point to it. And honestly, the Halo uplights aren't even the most reliable thing on earth. And they also advertise them as cool burning and being able to flush mount it. However, my Panama Halo was not cool burning. I could definitely feel a lot of heat coming off of that thing, and it wasn't just, you know, where it plugged in, it was across the whole, you know, the whole ring. So that wasn't even true. But yeah, you know, throughout the 2000s, they did continue to add tons of great designs, but then they also had a few blunders and things that just didn't make a whole lot of sense. And then we come to the early 2010s when we start noticing something a little bit different. The classic design formats are gone. You know, while a lot of these older products, you know, were different, they still just shared some very similar, you know, designs and features that I noticed sort of vanish. And also just the quality and the feel of the materials changed right around 2012 when they introduced the redesigned Brescia model, and then they introduced the Ainsworth and a few other designs. I could already see with these that these were completely different from everything that they've been offering before. And then 2013 comes around, and this is a very, very, very controversial year for Casablanca. Some people kind of liked what they did, although most people did not like it. Basically, everybody was a naysayer at first, and a few people did eventually shift. I was always a naysayer, still am a naysayer. However, I'm not saying that all of the products after this point were horrible, because that is simply not true. Now, throughout the, basically from around 2013 to around 2014-15, they basically redesigned all the legacy products, and by 2016, or 2017 really, they were all gone. There was nothing legacy left. Everything was, you know, around less than 10 years old, you know, when they designed it there. So, you know, at this point there was a huge shift there. And in terms of the feel and the quality of the products, that definitely went down. And honestly, in my opinion, a lot of the designs did too. I don't really hate a lot of them, but compared to the old ones, I really do prefer the older designs. Not to mention that Hunter's new mounting system that they introduced had a triangular ball with no notch on it, and this caused tons of excessive wobble. While this was not recalled for falling through, and actually it wasn't recalled at all, it still just was not very good. It wobbled a lot, and it just wasn't really working out too good. And a lot of the other components, like the blade arms, could be snapped really easily. The blades didn't feel too good. They were a lot lighter, and just overall they weren't as good. However, in terms of the CFM, some of the energy ratings and the performance and all that, there were definitely some improvements, like on the Concentra model that I showed earlier. They did actually improve that one somewhat, although I do prefer the original design. And then around 2016, they introduced a plethora of new products, probably about 10, maybe 15 models, I'd say. All of these really impressed me. I was actually really excited when this catalog came out. There were so many cool designs, and it was the first time I was excited to see something from Casablanca in a while, especially their Duluth fan. That fan was probably the last super, super, super good Casablanca product that they made. While it did use the XTR motor, it still is better than a lot of the other motors that they were offering at that point. And also, it performed good, and it was extremely well made. It felt really solid. My only complaint is, of course, the triangular ball mounting system, but otherwise, I was pretty impressed with that fan. And a lot of the other designs, like the Corrine, however you say that, the Stingray, the Orchid, even the Glen Arbor, and quite a few other designs that they introduced, they were just really good. I was really impressed by them as well. And then one thing I did neglect to mention, that was in around 2013, 2014, they introduced Custom Casablanca. This replaced their standard and badge series blades. Essentially, Custom Casablanca was a new thing, and they continued to add some products to it. However, really after they redesigned all the old products, they didn't really add many fans to it. They added maybe 1 or 2 models, and that was it. And that didn't really, pan out the way that I was expecting it to. And then by around 2019, 2020, most of them were gone, and now I don't even think Custom Casablanca has existed for a few years. And then around 2017, Hunter and Casablanca mashed their catalogs together into one. Now this really killed Casablanca, because then they were just at the back of the catalog, or on the flip side of the catalog. It was much shorter, and it just wasn't really working out. They introduced a couple designs in 2017. They didn't introduce anything in 2018 or 19. In 2020, they introduced one fan. They introduced a couple finishes in 2023. And then this year, 2024, they finally added 2 new designs. But overall, the Casablanca name really got ignored. It's like it wasn't there. Not to mention that it doesn't even feel like you're buying a Casablanca anymore, but I will get to that later. Basically, a lot of what we appreciated was gone, and they weren't paying attention to it. They were all just stuffed into the back of the catalog, getting no attention paid to them. It was like, nobody even really goes out and buys a Casablanca. I don't even remember the last time I've seen a new Casablanca in person installed anywhere. So, they really didn't, they didn't sell. They just didn't do a whole lot. They were just sort of, there in the back of the catalog, not doing much. So that's essentially a timeline and a few of the flaws throughout the way. Now, what really went wrong here? Why was this so gosh darn horrible? Well, you see, back in the day, Casablanca was eccentric. They had quality, they had innovation, they had just so many fascinating things. They had a unique quality, something that you couldn't really get out of any other fans. Even some of the similar fans like Emerson's, which were great still, there was something about a Casablanca that was just different. And that, now this doesn't necessarily make them better. Everybody's got their own opinions. I even do prefer Emerson over Casablanca, but still needs to be said. Anyways, what really did go wrong was the fact that after they hunterized the line, as I like to say, and they got rid of all the legacy products and they got rid of all that, basically everything was being manufactured the same way as the Hunter products. They were all essentially just slightly more expensive Hunter products, some of them sharing Casablanca designs, some of them with slightly elevated designs. But there wasn't really anything special anymore, it felt like, besides in 2016 with a few of those intros. It just felt like everything was just a slightly more expensive Hunter product that, honestly, why would you bother with? Why would you waste your money and your time on that when you can get a much better product for a similar price range? It just felt like while the prices and the prestige stayed the same, the product quality did not. It declined, and it lost its edge, even though in some ways they gained a new edge with the new type of consumer, as consumers change throughout time. Still though, what Casablanca was known for, I just kind of feel like went away. It lost its big, eccentric personality. It was just like it was, well, obviously Casablanca was always a high-end sort of designer showroom brand. However, there comes a time when the designer part of it just becomes a little bit too much, and it just takes away from everything else. That's kind of what happened, and even though most of the designs weren't even that good, besides, like, once again, 2016 with some of those great introductions and a few exceptions elsewhere throughout, it just really felt like nothing was what it was, nothing was too good, and nobody really paid as much attention to it. And as companies continue to change and follow trends, Casablanca didn't really do that. Now, following your own thing is big. Many companies have done this. Minka did it a little bit, Craftmade did it, Regency. A lot of these brands did that. However, they maintained a quality. They had something special there. Whereas these products, they weren't as special. They weren't really following a lot of the trends as well. While a lot of the designs, around that time weren't the worst. Still, I just feel like they weren't really going with what everybody else was doing. And, that's a big thing these days. It's a lot harder to do your own thing now than it was before. And the brand just sort of, declined, faded away to nothing. I feel like what Casablanca really needs to do to get back on track is to start really getting out there and getting creative again. Because I felt like with the two new products that they introduced this year, the Vespucci and the the Sura reminded me a lot of other Hunter products that we have seen in the past, and it just wasn't all that interesting. The Vespucci, on the other hand, I really adored, and this would be the kind of thing I would really expect to see from Casablanca. So if we can get a lot more innovation back into there, and we can change some things, I feel like we could do good. Because the other deal is that Hunter is introducing just so many designs all the time. A lot of them could honestly pass more for Casablancas than Hunters. And, that's another thing, not to mention some of the Casablanca products have been switched over to the Hunter line, and they're called Hunter now. I just really feel like they need to define Casablanca more. They need to get back in there. I feel like there's a lot of nice Hunter products or nicer Hunter products that would fall under the Casablanca line a lot better. This line needs a lot more of a definition again. It doesn't really have the definition that it used to have. And that is, I think, what it needs to regain. They need to innovate. They need to get out there more. I just feel like so many Hunter products these days follow the same sort of line of design. There's just not a whole lot different. And it just feels like I'm staring at the same fan over and over again in some ways. And I'm honestly just not really a big fan. They seriously need to start innovating, getting out there, doing some more stuff again. And I feel like we could see a return for Casablanca, and it would be good. And I would welcome it. As much as I love the legacy products and, all that was my favorite time period, still, the Casablanca name is just so rich in history. We all know it. And I feel like it just deserves to really be, something. And, I mean, it's so iconic that just tons of people that I know and talk to, just on a daily basis who don't know anything about fans, they're like, hey, I got an old Casablanca fan, these things are great. I'm like, yeah, I know they are, aren't they? It's like everybody knows this brand. Whereas now, it just feels like when you're saying you know it, you're saying you know the old stuff. Nobody says, oh, I've got a Casablanca, or have you heard of Casablanca? They're nice, and they're like, oh yeah, you mean that brand new fan they introduced a few years ago? Yeah, that was really nice. No, they're like, yeah, I got this really old computerized fan from the 1980s, and it is great. It's been running quiet for over 30 years. It just, everything that Casablanca is known for, it's all built on the past, none of the future. And as many of us know, and if you don't know, this is some of the biggest life advice, is that relying on the past and dwelling on the past and staying in the past, it's just not going to work. You got to change, and change freaking sucks, but sometimes, you have to. And this brand needs to really change, and it needs to create a new legacy for itself. And, that's what I'm hoping will happen. And another thing that really I do have a problem with is that a Casablanca executive came into a local store and told them, why on earth would you repair these old fans? Why are so many people repairing these old fans? Nobody should be doing this. You should trash these old pieces of junk and buy these brand new fans. And then, in about 5-10 years, when they go bye-bye, they just have them buy another one. This company clearly doesn't care like it used to back when Casablanca was just Casablanca. Now it's all about selling, a product and just constantly making money. There's no other, it just feels like there's not much more passion behind it anymore. And that is another really big problem. The fact that they're making fans not last as long just so people go out and buy new ones in a few years. That's just, it's lazy, it's cheap, but everybody's doing that these days. So are you really surprised? Probably not. I sure know that I'm not. But yeah, really, they need to get some quality back into that line. They need to rejuvenate it. They need to bring it up to bring it back to the times, and this year was definitely a good start to that. And they need to rebuild that legacy and get back out there. And I feel like if they do that, we could definitely notice quite a big difference in the brand, and it might actually be something that I would say, you know what, go ahead, buy yourself a Casablanca. It's not a bad fan. And still, they're not really bad fans. It just feels like there's nothing special. And for some of the prices you pay, It makes no sense. Now, that is another thing I want to mention. Casablanca, a lot of it is really expensive. However, the two products they introduced this year were at a pretty good price range. Still for the product you're getting, it's not too good. However, it's definitely better than it was before. Because like I said, a lot of the prices stayed the same, but the quality was just dropping, so it didn't make a lot of sense. But now I do feel like there is some improvement, so hopefully they can continue to follow this trend into success. Well, there we go. After about half an hour, I kind of summed up a basic history of Casablanca, talked about some of the flaws, what went wrong, what I think they need to do. So hopefully they will do some of those things. Obviously, they're probably not going to watch this video. However, still, I feel like some people are giving them the feedback, and maybe they do know that this is what they need to do. I'm not 100% sure. All I know is that they really need to get back out there and start experimenting, start having fun. Hunter has got boatloads of money now. They are doing really good. Everybody knows the Hunter name and the Casablanca name, basically, at this point. So why not spend some of that money and innovate and get back out there? Think about it. Casablanca spent millions and millions and millions in the early 80s to design the IntelliTouch. And look how well that paid off. They easily made that money back and a heck of a lot more. And the thing is, now that was much riskier. They didn't have as much money back then, back when it was just Casablanca. But now they've got a lot built up. So they need to experiment. They need to try things. There's nothing wrong with trying new things and getting out there and seeing what you can do. And that just goes for so many things. So hopefully they will do that. And yeah, well, that is about the end of this discussion video here. I actually didn't make it through this without much of a script. But of course, the history of Casablanca is something that so many of us know by heart. And a lot of these personal opinions are things that I talk about quite often. So it's pretty, it's pretty simple just to throw together into one sort of cohesive video about this subject. I would definitely love to hear your guys' takes, and I would also love to know what redesigned Casablanca products you actually did like more than the originals, and just a lot of other, opinions. I want to hear what everybody else thinks, and just overall what you guys also think should be done to bring this line back into what it should be. So yeah, thank you all so much for watching. As always, I really do appreciate your support. And if you did watch this whole video, then wow, good for you. That's pretty amazing. Anyways, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.